Good morning to you all. My name is Martijn Jonker, Manager of Product Development here at Secura, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar today. We will be discussing in this webinar the importance of assessing, monitoring, and subsequently managing your external attack surface, or rather the external attack surface of your organization. Right next to me is Ralph Moonen, our CTO, who will be hosting the webinar today. And please feel free to ask questions during the webinar in the questions section. I will try to address, or we will try to address these during the webinar or at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation and the webinar, there's also a survey possibility, and we would very much welcome your feedback. Ralph, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martijn, for that introduction. As Martijn mentioned, my name is Ralph Moonen. I'm the CTO, Technical Director at Secura, and well, Martijn runs the Product Development Department, among other tasks. And one of the very interesting topics that Martijn and I are dealing with currently is external attack surface monitoring. The introduction, I'll get to external attack surface monitoring in a minute. First, a few words about Secura. So if you don't know Secura already, well, we are a digital security expert company focusing on raising your cyber resilience. We were founded in the year 2000, and currently we are growing not just nationally, but also internationally. And since January 2021, we are part of the Bureau Veritas group. So it is 2023 currently, and as we see, a lot of attacks are increasing. I'm sure you've all heard about the ransomware attacks on high-profile targets, and it's not just ransomware, of course. There's also data breaches going on a daily basis, and if you look at why that is happening and what's going on, it's easy to lose the focus and just focus on one aspect of cybersecurity. For instance, your application security, or maybe your endpoint detection and response systems, or your SOC use cases and detection, or maybe vulnerability management on your external assets. But yeah, still these ransomware gangs, they find a way in, and in fact it's a whole ecosystem of criminal groups that interact with each other, and well, they call it their customers, but what they really mean is their victims. And I want to give you a little bit of insight first to start off with on how that ecosystem works and why that's important for your external attack surface. Because, you know, as Sun Tzu said, better to know your enemy, and if you know how they operate, then obviously you have more insight into how to prevent that. Now, there's a couple of very high-profile hacks in the last year. The ones on Okta, Microsoft, T-Mobile, Nvidia, they were all pretty high-profile hacks, and these are companies that have millions of euros of security budget, and despite that, they were hacked by a group called Lapsus. And you might think this is a highly sophisticated gang of cyber criminals. Well, there was a couple of teenagers in a bedroom. And so despite these millions of euros of security budget, they were compromised, well, using the easiest way in. And Lapsus was specifically targeting companies by stealing credentials, so usernames and passwords, and even bribing employees of their targets to provide them with access to the internal network. This is also how the Twitter breach was done. So there is a lot of activity in that marketplace of credentials. So obviously, looking at purely your external assets on the internet and the vulnerabilities maybe in a web application, well, that's not going to prevent these credentials from being sold and traded on the dark web. So how does this work, this ecosystem a little bit? Well, first of all, you have what we call initial access brokers. These are the groups or individuals that sell credentials on the dark web. And it's not just credentials, right? They are also selling network access to their targets. And this is why you can see on the dark web sometimes access being sold, and they usually describe it in terms of company in sector X, Y, or Z, maybe technology or a telecommunications company in this country with a group turnover of so many million euros. So this makes it then attractive to the ransomware gangs to say, okay, I will buy that initial access, and then we can roll out our ransomware and make some money. And of course, the price that these initial access brokers ask depends on the size of the company and the potential gains that a ransomware actor could get. Of course, it's all paid for in cryptocurrencies that is pretty untraceable. It's all on the dark web, so it's not like you can easily take down the websites that these credentials are and network access is sold on. Nevertheless, you do hear some successes sometimes. Just 3 weeks ago, the Genesis marketplace was taken down by the police, the FBI, and the Dutch police. And it turned out that on that marketplace, there were personal details, credentials being sold for millions and millions of people. There are more marketplaces, of course, than just Genesis Marketplace. The other really big one currently is called Russian Market. And I will show you later on in the presentation in this webinar what that looks like, how you can actually interact with that market if you so wanted to and had a criminal intent. Not that we'll be doing that, but I'll show you. So then the initial access brokers, they trade with the ransomware affiliates, and the ransomware affiliates themselves, they are the operators of the ransomware. They're not the creators of the ransomware. So there's another part in this ecosystem where you have software developers that develop the ransomware and license it to the affiliates, and the initial access brokers then provide the credentials. These are bought by the ransomware affiliates. And then finally, last step is to actually deploy the ransomware. And this whole ecosystem, it takes from a couple of days to a couple of weeks for these ransomware groups to do the attack. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, they have to go through the steps. So you have access, initial access, they have to sell it. It's usually a bidding process. So someone might ask for $1,000 at a minimum start bid, and then it goes up. So after a while, they have access, and then what the most ransomware gangs do is they exfiltrate the data, and they publish this on their website, on their they call it a PR site, and as I said, they call their targets, they call them customers, but they publish that here. And this screenshot that you're seeing now in the slide is an example of the leaked data. And this is done to provide some leverage towards paying the ransom. Okay, so there's these leaks; these can be monitored. The dark web it's dark. I mean, what they mean with that is that it doesn't show up in Google searches, and it's a slightly hidden part. It uses the Tor network to obfuscate and cover up the main pages. You cannot see them if you go to an IP address or a URL. You will have to start the Tor network to actually get access to these sites. And you can recognize them if you look at the top URL at a address that ends in .onion. So you see here the Lockbit PR site with a URL and a .onion there. So you can go there if you want. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can see what they have for sale there. And of course, this can be devastating for companies. There's a couple of examples of companies that have actually been forced to stop trading, such as Travelex, after a ransomware attack. I focused on ransomware just now, but don't forget your attack surface is also under attack, not just by ransomware gangs, but also by state actors. And well, the obvious suspects are mentioned in this slide. I won't go into detail, but what's important to note is that both these types of threat actors, so the criminals and the state actors and any other opportunistic type of threat actor, they are looking for the weak spots, and they don't care if that weak spot is buying a credential or bribing someone or whatever gets them in, right? So if you want to protect yourself, it doesn't really help if you have a static view of what your organization looks like from the outside. What do I mean by that? So well, we've broken it down into a couple of aspects after analyzing the modus operandi of these threat actors. And maybe a good analogy is to look at it as a fortification, a castle. This is your organization. An attacker will always be looking for those weak spots. Now, these could be an opening in the fortifications, like a gunnery portal on a castle, because you might be able to get in through that. You also might be able to get in through the front gate. You might need a trick to do that, maybe a Trojan horse, I'm just quoting history here. But there's also other ways, because maybe one of the guards left his keys in the cafe and exposed the actual keys to the kingdom that way. So the whole attack surface encompasses a lot more than just the security measures that have been placed, such as locks and doors and gates and moats and castles and thick walls. It also covers the stuff that mistakes that people have made, the exposures that exist due to human failure, interaction with third parties, and other types of exposures. So I'll just skip this one. One of the things that we see a lot currently is that when you are looking at this external attack surface, and with that we mean the whole system of exposures and credentials and the assets that you have on the internet, that there is a certain importance placed on basic hygiene. It's logical because it's very easy to check, but it does lead to systems where, for instance, having TLS 1.0 enabled on a website leads to a severe or a critical finding. Well, no one was ever hacked because they had TLS 1.0 available. So the reasons they are hacked is that someone bought a credential on the dark web. So there's lots of rating systems and external attack surface SaaS services out there these days that provide you with a type of score, but it's all very superficial. It's based on stuff like, do you have TLS 1.2 enabled, or other things that really no one ever used to be hacked. On the other hand, having an open port there that has no multi-factor authentication enabled and allows you access to, for instance, a remote desktop protocol server, an RDP server, that is classified in many systems, in many vulnerability scanners also, as a low risk finding, or maybe even not even a risk, but just a risk note. But those are the things that the attackers do use to get in with one of those stolen credentials. So we've broken it down into 4 main aspects, because what we see is that first of all, organizations do not really have a good view of what their assets are. So if you're going to look at an asset, at an attack surface, then the first step that you need to do is you need to find out what your assets are on the internet. And you might think that you know that because you have a domain name and you have your DNS, but it doesn't really always work that way. You also think you have certain IP ranges maybe registered to you, but still, have you checked that recently? Maybe you've done some acquisitions and you have some IP ranges that you forgot about, didn't know about, etc. From an attacker perspective, it's also interesting to look at what can be seen from an organization. So there's a lot of ways that you can do asset discovery, and I'll show you a few in a minute. Then the second part of an attack surface, in our opinion, is credentials. So which ones are being leaked on the internet in data dumps? So this then would be if your users in your domain have their accounts compromised on another website, and if they reuse the passwords, then of course this might be a problem for you also. So you need to look at which users of your organization are in those dumps. Second of all, you need to check, of course, whether they are being sold and traded on the dark web. The third part of an attack surface, in our view, is the exposures. And with exposures, we mean stuff that is out there that usually by accident, that should not be there. Think, for instance, about Amazon S3 buckets, so databases that have no credential set, i.e. no password set, and therefore are freely available. Or maybe a management interface to some kind of device with a username and a password, no multi-factor authentication enabled, and you can log in with admin. And another type of exposure that we see quite often is actually where people have inadvertently uploaded key materials to GitHub. So you have a software development department, they use GitHub, and they're developing a platform, and this uses, for instance, an API. And the API key is then part of the software, it's part of the configuration, it's maybe somewhere in a file, and everything is put on GitHub, and well, then it's publicly exposed. And there's been a couple of major cases here where that happened. I'll get to one example in a minute. Yeah, this can be a problem. And the final one, of course, is vulnerabilities, because it's classical vulnerability scanning. I mean, it's not dead per se. The title of our presentation is a bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless, you still need to look at vulnerabilities, of course, because they are there. They can be exploited. They are exploited by all the threat actors. So it makes no sense to, ignore that. So to get into a couple of examples of how these four aspects of external attack surfaces work, I'd like to go through a few examples. So if you're looking at asset discovery on the internet, how do you find the host names, the subdomains, the applications, and is there any way of actually going through them? So if you're looking here and you see this website called crt.sh, this is, for instance, a source of host names. And why is that? Well, these are the certificate transparency logs. Every time you request a certificate, so an HTTPS, an SSL certificate, TLS certificate for a web service, the name for that service is published in these certificate transparency logs, and you can search through them. I did a search here for rijksoverheid.nl to see which certificates had been requested for this domain. And you can see here, as I scroll through, that a lot of host names are used here. And also including things like this host name that I don't know what it is, but it's not something that you would guess easily. So an attacker can go here and look and find assets that are part of your domain. Another one that you can easily use, you probably know it, is Shodan, right? You can go here, you can find all kinds of assets that have been exposed to the internet. In fact, there is another tool, it's called Amass. I will just quickly go here to my terminal. And what Amass does is it combines all these sources and extracts through various ways all the host names within a domain. So I'll run this in the background on our own domain on secura.com. We'll get back to this in a minute.
While this is running, perhaps I can remind the people viewing that if they want, they can ask questions to us in the questions option of the webinar software. And up to now, it's been completely clear, apparently, because no questions yet.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martijn. So while this is running, you'll see some output come by in a minute. Go back to the slideshow here. So the asset discovery part is not just the assets that you think you have, but that an attacker can see. And often we find that, well, companies think they have an X amount of assets. We usually find more. So that means that our customers have an incomplete view of their own exposures in terms of assets on the internet. That's the cert and the Shodan. So then we have the credentials, and this is where it becomes fun, because you know, it's not often that people go out there on the dark web to find their credentials. In fact, it would not be advisable to do that yourself on a daily basis. However, there are other companies, threat intel providers, that do this for you. And I can give you an example here. If I go to my browser again and I go here to our TI provider, and we search here for rijksoverheid.nl. Sorry if there's any people for rijksoverheid.nl, but this is a public service, public, how would you call that? A governmental institution. And of course, they are very public. And it would be interesting to see if there's anything being leaked on the dark web about this domain, rijksoverheid.nl. So you see that the answer to that is yes, there are leaked credentials. So that means that email addresses for rijksoverheid.nl have been leaked in certain leaks. You can see here in this column which leak it is. And here you see some of the names of the people. I'll quickly go away here so that they don't compromise these people too much. And you can see that also in the tab compromised accounts, there's being bots actually sold now on the bot markets. And what is bots? So bots are compromised endpoints, so laptops or PCs, usually of people at home, that they use to log in to company resources. And you can buy the data sets of these bots on the dark web. They're not that expensive. As I said, Genesis Market is an example of that. The Russian market is also another example. And it costs typically 10 euros to 20 euros to buy a full data set and credentials. And this is, of course, not a lot of money. And you really need to take into account here that this is information that is published on the dark web, but not just that. The data dumps are also shared in Telegram channels. There's also underground websites where you can download a lot of these password breaches and password dumps. And there's other companies too. I'm sure you've heard of the website haveibeenpwned.com. And you can type your email address in there and do a search to see if you have been compromised. So this, of course, is it's a paid service. we use this as our TI provider, and there's many others, so I'm not advertising here for this specific one, but it is definitely a part of the attack surface that you need to take a look at. Then we have, let's see, exposures. So the exposures actually is another interesting one, because there's various other websites and services that you can go to check your exposures. One of the more famous ones is a site called greyhatwarfare.com, where you can actually go and search for open S3 buckets, and you can type in any kind of search word, keyword there, and get a response. Let's see if we have it over here. Yeah, this is Grey Hat Warfare. So I've done a search for Secura.com, and I see here that there's 2 mentions of Secura.com in public Amazon S3 buckets. Fortunately, it's 2 pictures, it's probably a logo or something, or maybe it's not even about us. That happens a lot too. Nevertheless, you can find that here. And you might think, well, you know, what's the chance of there being data of mine out there in an Amazon S3 bucket that is not secured? But hey, if you don't look, you don't know. And second of all, you might be surprised, because there have been cases of you know, S3 buckets being out there, being found with very large data sets of sensitive information. And the slide I just skipped over just now is an example of that one. This was a famous case in the Netherlands not too long ago, where a Chinese database was open on the internet, and it contained real-time data of millions and millions of Chinese people that were being tracked at that time by the Chinese government. Luckily, that was taken offline pretty quickly. I promised you a cool example of one of the exposures on GitHub. So GitHub actually exposed their own RSA SSH key on GitHub. It was a mistake. It was only exposed for a very short while, but it did mean that they had to replace and revoke their SSH key to protect their own operations. So it can happen to the best. It is certainly something that's happened before. There was also a Dutch government institution that leaked their Azure key, so their cloud credentials actually on GitHub not too long ago. And yeah, if you don't look for these things, then you will definitely not find them. There's other threat intel providers that allow you to search for hard-coded credentials in code and exposures on GitHub. Digital Shadows is, for instance, another TI provider that provides these services. And finally, as I mentioned, we have the vulnerabilities that still need to be tested for dealing with missing patches, outdated software, basically CVEs that are known or unknown to you, or configuration issues. So you still need to look at those aspects. Another interesting site that you, if you're in the public sector in the Netherlands, might know is basisbeveiliging.nl. This is a website where you can go and you can take a look at, yeah, it's not a very in-depth view, but it is a very broad view of your attack surface. This website continuously scans all public entities in the Netherlands, so gemeentes, so local councils, provinces. I think they also do healthcare, so the hospitals, and probably also education. I don't know for sure. Anyway, you can go there and you can click on the where you are, if you're a gemeente, so a town, and yeah, look and see what they have in terms of assets. So this site is pretty good in asset discovery, and I would recommend you to go there. And even if you're not part of the public sector, then still it can be interesting to browse around here and see if, yeah, you have any exposures. So I get asked a lot, is there actually a relation to pen testing. And well, the problem with standard pen testing, if you're looking at attack surfaces, is that pen testing is usually at the wrong time with a limited scope and not a very good risk indicator. So it will give you lots of vulnerabilities, it will look in depth, but if you're looking at when CVEs are discovered, so when the actual vulnerabilities are discovered versus when they're fixed and when the pen test is done, you will see that 9 times out of 10, the pen test says you're fine, or you have some vulnerabilities, but you can fix them. And then a couple of days later, the CVE comes out for a product that your website or your environment uses, and you're vulnerable again. So it doesn't help to do a pen test once a year. You need to be looking at attack surfaces on a continuous basis. So not just, a one-off assessment can give you a very good insight. I would definitely do that, but you really need to be doing this on an ongoing basis to cover the timelines for vulnerabilities. Also, a pen test is usually a limited scope. You're just looking at a specific application or specific IP range. And what you really want to be doing is looking at the 4, well, I call them the pillars of external attack surfaces. So discovery, credentials, vulnerabilities, and exposures. And yeah, I've mentioned it before. You need to be looking at the actual risks to your organization of these aspects. I mentioned the example of TLS 1.0 being rated a critical rating, and one of the things here is that it also leads to a bit of a false sense of security, because if you're being governed by some risk score that says, oh, you have 5 servers on the internet with TLS 1.0, and therefore you have a risk rating of, I don't know, 5 out of 10, you will be motivated now to fix that, right? You will be saying, let's prioritize our implementing TLS 1.2 to get my risk score up from 5 to maybe 8. So you've done that. You spent time, you spent money on that, you've used company resources. Have you now become more secure? I'm going to say no, absolutely not, because you addressed non-issues, and you really need to be looking at other stuff. So these credentials, the actual exposures, and go out there on the internet to find them.
One of the viewers asked a question in the meantime. Are there, could you mention some quick wins that people should implement though?
Quick wins to implement, well, it depends on if you want to just reduce your attack surface or get insight into your attack surface. A quick win could definitely be to use a couple of the sites that I mentioned, such as Grey Hat Warfare, to go to see it, because that's a free site, right? So you don't have to pay there. There's a free tier at least. You can get more results if you pay, I think, what is it, 25 a month, something like that. And go out there to see if you have any exposures in Amazon S3 buckets. I'll just quickly go back, by the way, to the terminal, because as you see here, it's being this tool has now run its discovery, and it's querying a lot of other sources. So we mentioned Shodan, but there's also Censis and Robtex and EarlScan, Alien Vault. These are all other sites that provide ways of enumerating domains and finding the associated hosts within a domain. So in terms of discovery, we've already discovered here quite a few things in the secura.com domain. It's not finished yet, this scan, so I'll just quickly go back. So one of the quick wins is use these sites that I just mentioned. Shodan and Censis is another good one, .com, and see what you can find yourself in terms of exposed assets. The dark web monitoring stuff is maybe not a quick win because most TI providers are pretty expensive. I think that I'll give that. It's a good question, so I'll give it a bit more thought, and at the end of the presentation, we'll come back to that. There was one more thing I wanted to say, but I forgot about that. Anyway, doesn't matter. The combination of these four pillars is something that we're not seeing a lot in many other services. So Secura, we are developing a service that encompasses that all. So our own external attack surface assessment and monitoring service. So that's a good way to get started in this, and we offer that currently in a one-off assessment type, where we will look at all those four parts and do the dark web scraping for you and do the asset discovery for you and look at the exposures. And in the second half of this year, we'll be also launching an actual monitoring service where we will be doing this on an ongoing basis, so that you have continuous insight and you can raise your cyber resilience that way. I think that we do have a lot of time for some questions, so I would hope that I think we have 10 more minutes for questions. Is that correct, Martijn?
I believe you have already one question popped up,
Okay.
for a few questions actually. One is if this external access attack services monitoring service is finished, what would it look like? Would it be a subscription service, etc.? Perhaps you can also point to the other services that you mentioned that are available on the dark web as well.
Yeah. Okay, so our own service, in the one-off assessment type, the result is a report, just like a vulnerability scan report or a pen test report, but it will contain all the details on all the credentials and lots of appendices with where you can find all these exposures and management interfaces. And we can do one more thing, only if the customer, of course, allows that. That is that we can actually test those credentials that we found in those data breaches and on the dark web to see if they are still valid on your attack surface, right? So that's a very powerful way of actually assessing, well, could an attacker also do that? And am I at risk now?
Would this also make the distinction between our generic services that we already have, the pen testing services, web application testing, the crystal box testing, etc.? Because those dive in deeper, right?
That is correct. Yes. So those are very much more focused towards finding all the vulnerabilities on a very specific scope, right? Going in depth, and this is looking much broader. The attack surface monitoring service that we will be launching second half of this year, that will be much more an interactive portal type of service where you can log in and see your findings and browse through them and hopefully fix them as you see them.
Okay. Suppose in an ideal world that somebody would take a subscription to this, would that then be a guarantee for a good night's rest, to rest comfortably?
Well, I would certainly sleep better if I had such a thing. But of course, it's not the full picture of cybersecurity, because cybersecurity itself as a field is a lot broader than that. First of all, we've been talking about external attack surfaces. So that means stuff that you can see from the internet. It does not say anything about internal attack surfaces. So if an attacker has access to your network, either he bought it on the dark web or he figured out himself how to do it, then yeah, it's a whole nother ball game, because on your internal network, the attack surface is usually a lot bigger, a lot more complex, because you have all your internal business applications that are also exposed to the internal network. You might have totally different security measures, such as intrusion detection, network intrusion detection, or EDR, MDR, so basically antivirus, but then with a lot more monitoring going on. And yeah, you still need to address that also, right? And so yes, external attack surface monitoring or assessment is extremely important, but yeah, the internal side of things, you must not forget that.
And it's not the silver bullet, I hear.
No, it's definitely not a silver bullet. I would maybe, it does address a lot of things that have not been addressed properly before.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
One of the viewers asks if we could dive in a little bit deeper on the ICS specific external attack service, not only the tool, but capabilities, protocols, scenarios.
So ICS, industrial control systems, yes. Okay, very interesting indeed, because a part of your attack surface can indeed not just be standard IT assets, but industrial assets. So maybe you have, because a vendor placed them there, and you have some RTUs or maybe some PLCs. So these are typical components that you would see in an OT environment, an ICS environment. And you have them exposed on the internet. In fact, we have done some research on that. You can go to our website, secura.com, and if you look at OT attack surface, then you will find a paper that we published last year on the discoverability of OT assets on the internet. It's out there. Yes, we found a lot of building management systems, in fact. And these systems, yeah, they expose a lot of information about where they are, what they can do. But you can imagine that a building management system is not something that you would want to have floating out on the internet. Shodan is, of course, a very well-known search engine to find these kinds of exposures. So you can go there and you can query Shodan with various tags and find all kinds of OT systems and ICS systems there. Yes. It is definitely something to take into account. It's not just IT, it's also very much OT and IoT.
One of the viewers states or acknowledges the fact mostly that, of course, things like MFA should definitely be one of the important factors to focus on.
Yes.
Having a view into your leaked credentials is after the fact, just like the TLS stuff, etc. So it's not the complete picture. It's only one of the aspects, right? To have a view on your leaked credentials.
Absolutely, but also don't forget that multi-factor authentication is extremely important, but also that is not the silver bullet, because there's quite a few ways to get around MFA. They usually do involve some bit of social engineering, but sometimes not at all. Because, for instance, as an example, if you look at the Microsoft Authenticator that is configured with just push messages, then if we do a password spraying attack and there is, let's say we've targeted 200 accounts, people get these push messages saying on their phone, have you, if this is not you, don't log in, but people just press yes. I mean, they're sitting at breakfast, they haven't logged in anywhere. They get this push message and they go, oh yeah, sure, come in. And you only need one person to do that. Right. This is, of course, being addressed in Microsoft Authenticator with the code. So you now have a number that you need, security number that you need to type over.
Yes.
But you have to have that configured, of course, and enabled. Right, and not everyone does that because it's again a little bit of more user interaction, and users don't really like that.
Exactly, the coworkers should be aware, of course, that if they get a pop-up like that at an unexpected moment, they will feel uncomfortable, to say the least, and be aware that somebody is doing this.
So when we do a red teaming exercise, for instance, this is a way that we get in. We help the user a little bit along. Maybe we call them and we say, hello, this is your help desk. Did you just get a message? You can ignore them, but they'll keep on coming. So if you want to get rid of them, just press once on yes.
All right.
This works.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're reaching the end of our webinar, though. I would like to remind you, there's some time left, but
do we have any more questions?
Not that many anymore. And what I very much liked when I saw the previous slide is that in one of them was actually a show of conscience from the hackers, because there was a hospital in there, right?
Yeah. So that was the Lockbit ransomware group when they ransomed a children's hospital. and they had a bit of internal discussion about that, and then they published that, sorry, this is against our ethical standards, so they gave back the hospital's data for free. Right.
Cool.
And they banned that affiliate. So I mean, it's really strange seeing that criminals like that apparently suddenly grow a conscience or something. I think it was more to save their bad reputation as ruthless killers, but yeah.
Yeah, I think having some ethical boundaries in a hacker community is also quite nice.
Well, this is a criminal community.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the difference,
yeah.
huh?
All right. Thank you. Well, I think we have reached the end of our webinar then.
We have.
I would like to thank you very much, Ralph.
Thank you.
I would like to thank our viewers. I would like to remind them that there's a survey at the end. Please let us know how you found our webinar today. And of course, you can find more information on our website and or give us a call, or you know how to reach us. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye.